Slutar vi klaga här. Artist eller nummer?
Oh, that's something. Go on, then. Start. Good morning. It'll be about one more minute. Now you've got failed to load. This is a good start. Failed to start. Starting. There you go. You're coming slowly. This is the presentation you did play software. There it is. Yep, there you go. Oops, there you lost it. Yeah.
Yes. Haha. Hello.
Hey.
Good Friday morning to all of you, and thanks so much for being here after a long week of IETF. So that's very much appreciated. We also got a full agenda with a lot of interesting speakers, presentations, discussions, both remote and locally. So you're set up for an exciting 2 hours with Avri Doria and me, Niels ten Hoever, as your co-chairs. You are here in the Human Rights Protocols Considerations Research Group, which is an effort of the Internet Research Task Force. If you are not here for that, you are probably in the wrong place. If you,
But you're welcome to stay anyway.
yeah, we welcome stragglers. Join the mailing list. All the drafts are on GitHub. If you see this remotely, you are already on Meet Echo, and we are looking for a note taker. Going once. Yes? Thank you. And then a Jabber scribe. We have a Jabber scribe?
I thought we did.
We have a Jabber. Thanks so much.
Sorry.
We have a quite full agenda, as you see, but is there anyone who would like to bash the agenda? No? This is the note well. Please note it well. If you haven't seen this yet, it is probably good to study it a bit more at the IETF webpage. It's about declaring intellectual property and the ability for us and others to use it. So please also review documents. Do not only author them or do not only check your email, because the quality of our work here is dependent on reviews. So as a rule of the thumb, for the amount of documents that you contribute, please at least review twice as much. The status of the research group, we've been at this since roughly 2015. We've made quite some progress. Since last session, we also have an RFC that came out of our work, 8280, but we'll touch upon more of that work during the session. What are we here trying to do? We're trying to understand the relationship between protocols and human rights and try to develop guidelines that protect the internet as a human rights enabling environment, and to increase the awareness of both awareness of technology in the human rights community and human rights in the technical community. Someone who has looked at this in great depth, especially the technical community and their understanding about rights and civil liberties, is Sandra Brahman of Texas A&M University. Sandra is a very authoritative author in the field of governance studies and science and technology studies. And Sandra has read a lot of RFCs and analyzed them carefully, even though it was sometimes as reading Martian upside down, as she said herself. She will tell us a bit about those experiences, the conclusions that she was able to draw from that, and what that could mean for us. Sandra, please come in.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm humbled and delighted to be here with you. I've learned a lot from you over the course of the week, and I think the questions that you're asking are really amongst the most fundamentally important of our times. So all I can do here is hope to help us all think together a few steps further. The question of human rights and civil liberties in the course of the internet design process was introduced first as a joke by Vint Cerf, who has added this question of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness fairly early on, making fun of the whole possibility. But of course, shortly it was realized that actually these were really fundamentally important issues for the design community. I want to put what we're talking about here within the general political and legal context. We're undergoing a transformation in law-state society relations that historians of the law describe as profound in terms of their importance as what we experienced at the Westphalian moment several hundred years ago when the international system of states was first formed. In other words, historians of the law and political scientists believe that we are at a sort of 500-year rhythm of profound transformations in the nature of our political and legal systems. That includes a growing tension between geopolitical citizenship and what I have called in a publication network citizenship, and I'll be referring to that concept as we go through today. I believe we have what I describe as an informational state, that is a form of state that preferences informational power over power in its instrumental form. I'm hitting you over the head. Its structural forms, I'm shaping the institutions and rules that you follow, and symbolic forms, I'm persuading you how to think. But as the informational state evolves, it becomes less and less confident about what its identity even is. When you look at the Talon manuals, which are places where the international legal scholars have looked at how existing international law applies to cyber crime and cyber warfare, they have moved to the concept of emanations. They are never sure when informational network presences outside of the geopolitical boundaries are actually those of the state or not. So as we become more and more informationally intense and network reliant, the very identity of the state as a functional entity is coming into increasing question. We are seeing the appearance of new policy principles, and the first that has become evident to me is the right not to know. We've seen it for the state. Again, when you look at international laws of warfare, states prefer increasingly not to know what's going on in their networks, because then they have a kind of responsibility for that they would prefer not to have. We have that at the individual level as the right to be forgotten. And it's just worth pointing out here that we have certain human rights principles that we have assumed for hundreds, even in some cases 1,000 years, to be fundamental to how we are as humans, but we're also seeing new principles appearing, and we need to keep an eye out for those and think about what they mean for those with which we are most familiar. It is becoming more difficult to identify what is even the subject of the law in the digital environment. So on the one hand, we have this growing body of robot law and actually serious discussions of treating bots, whether materially embodied or not, as legal subjects. And you have the question which the WikiLeaks, the Chelsea Manning trial brought to our attention, the problem of how you deal with a unit like an autonomous network. In the government, the US government's case in the Manning trial actually put forward a number of different ways of thinking about WikiLeaks as a legal subject that range from the obvious, the biological. It's like an onion with a number of layers. So at the center you have the biological entity we understand, Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning. But at the outer rim, the US government actually got a court to sign off on treating anyone who had looked at Twitter about WikiLeaks, maybe because you were just curious, as a member of WikiLeaks and legally responsible for everything that happened. They haven't acted on that, but they put that definition of WikiLeaks forward in terms of who is involved with what went on as and should be legally subject to legally accountable for it. We have different kinds of legal systems that have dealt with information and communication technologies. In the U.S., historically, we had three: the print, broadcasting, and telecommunications. Both broadcasting and telecommunications are regulated by the FCC, but with completely different systems. Ithiel de Solapool, in a seminal book I still highly recommend, in 1983, pointed out that predicted that as the legal systems converged in its necessary response to the convergence of technologies, it was likely that the most repressive elements of each system would be the ones that dominated, and in fact, that is what we are seeing. To put it mildly, we are having this conversation today during a period in which human rights are under extreme and intensifying threat. I think Niels may think I'm a bit nuts for the depth of my concern about what's going on in the United States right now. I did let him know that if there were nuclear war, I probably wouldn't be flying here. But this should not be underestimated, and we are seeing something really qualitatively different and profoundly dangerous. Among the things that's going on, though, is a movement away from the facts as the basis for decision-making, political and legal decision-making, so that's very important from the human rights perspective. About 2005, the FBI in the U.S. got into trouble because under the USA Patriot Act, it was identifying targets of surveillance on the basis of what turned out to be bad information from a criminal information database. And when confronted with the problem, the Congress actually gave FBI the right to target individuals for surveillance on the basis of no information at all. That was the solution to the problem. We have seen the growth of what I call evidence-averse policymaking since the 1970s, actually, and of course, under the current administration, that trend has been profoundly exacerbated. In that kind of context, whether or not personal information is leaking becomes, frankly, irrelevant. There are other things identifying people who are of interest. So the research that I'm presenting a few bits from today was funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation. The question was how technical decision makers for the internet, you folks, thought about legal and policy, and it turned out political issues in the course of the design process. It was not only to me Martian upside down, but in a mirror. It was, since I'm not a computer scientist, I did have computer scientists advising me as I went along. And I've been very pleased, I must say, in the years I've been presenting this, at the number of people within your community who have found themselves very interestingly reflected. So I'm always pleased, open to critique. So let me know where the work can be improved. Policy issues showed up very early. I'd like to show you a bit of what your thinking looks like from the perspective of a legal scholar and a policy analyst. Security shows up in 1970. By 1971, there's already talking about commercialization of the internet, already talking about access to the network in rural areas, the malicious environment, of course, and internationalization. By 1972, they're already talking about environmental and energy problems. 1973, we get the need for user authentication and spam. There's a lot of attention to policy making within the RFCs. There are announcements of positions. This is what internet telephony is. There was an effort to say that wiretapping was outside the scope. This was during the Vietnam War era, and there were a number of very strong political statements before the RFC process became so formalized about whether or not people involved in the design process should be serving the goals of the U.S. government. So they did establish policy positions. They treat general legal issues like fraud and privacy as, from the beginning, the most frequently discussed policy issue, although privacy is also a good example of why I did an inductive reading rather than using a computerized textual analysis. I found actually 18% of the documents had the word privacy, but 6% of those were actually spurious references. If you were reading for actual discussion of privacy issues, it's other terminology, hide your input, other kinds of things. And so I really believe that in this terrain, that computerized analysis is very iffy. The subject matter keeps changing, the language keeps changing, and so forth. And of course, there was attention to internet-specific legal issues. There are responses, direct responses to U.S. law. It was a comment about something that was sought technically, but may not have been possible under the existing regulatory environment in the U.S. at that point. References to cryptographic specifications under national security law in the U.S., and responses to laws of other countries. It was the Canadian government that showed up in the RFC process first, again with that insistence on paying attention to rural areas. And by 3837, there's awareness that the jurisdictional issue is quite complex. Yes.
There's a clarifying question on Jabber. Could you define inductive reading for the group?
Yes. Deductive analysis, you start with your hypothesis. You have a theoretically based idea about what you expect to find, and then you develop methods and indicators for how to find that out, and then verify or support your hypothesis or find you must discard it or change it. In an inductive reading, you are reading and gathering the concepts from the text. So you're building theory from the text up, interpreting the concepts from the text up, rather than walk in with concepts in your head in a preconceived manner. Thank you. There is policy analysis that takes place in the RFC. So of course, there's a lot of technical background for the network neutrality debate. This is one of my kind of pet peeves in the network neutrality environment. All the social scientists and activists and advocates who are asking internet designers to think about fairness. Of course, you have been thinking about fairness all the way along. The problem is that every door you open is a door that is shut, and it's very complicated to figure out who's going to win and who's going to lose and how to balance it. So this is an example of an area in which I think that those working in the political and legal environments around network neutrality could gain a lot from exposure to the kind of thinking that you all have put into this area. I have a journal article about to come out on that. We have some response to the spam law from Congress that simply didn't, U.S. Congress, that simply didn't work for technical reasons. Again, an example of why people in the political and legal environments should be paying much more attention to and know much more about how the network really operates in order for the law to even make any of their legal efforts to make any sense. You do find in the RFC support for some people who are critical of the internet design process. There was very little on disability. Elder issues are not mentioned at all. But there's also a lot of evidence that counters critics. I gave the example of, are you thinking about fairness? Yes, you are and always have been. But another example is the criticism, in my view, is the criticism on the language front, which was understood to be a human rights related issue very, very early on. It is simply that, as you all know better than I, there are a number of technical problems that have to be solved in order to meet that policy goal. That's a different thing from not acknowledging it as a policy goal. There's a lot of what I would call implicit policy analysis. So even in the first decade, another piece that I published on, I found that the technical analysis of privacy was far more, so we're talking 1969 to 1979, is actually far more sophisticated and nuanced than we have been seeing up until the point of differential privacy as a move forward, but is otherwise much more, even in that decade, sophisticated and nuanced than what we're seeing in the social science or the legal or the political environments. Another case in which the legal people could learn from you. You engage in policy making. What is the policy subject? You've, of course, developed your decision-making procedures, established implementation programs. You are a venue for conflicts and conflict resolution. Again, you all know much more about that than I. There is explicit political analysis. So there are over 36 RFCs that explicitly talk about citizenship, including exploring the concept of net citizenship and what it would mean operationally. There are over 70 RFCs that talk about jurisdiction, which is the legal question of in what territory the laws of a particular entity apply. Increasingly, it's clear, of course, and this is what I meant by the emanations of the state reference. It's increasingly clear that the identity of network citizenship and that of geopolitical citizenship are becoming detached from each other, offering new political opportunities, perhaps. I think your early attitudes towards users are important in the sense of if you're thinking about human rights, who are the entities about whom you would be concerned. So it was interesting to see that, of course, the goal was all comers and to expand usage from the beginning, but then new users are also cranky and have new demands and create new problems because they don't know what's going on. There was an expectation from the beginning that users would be heterogeneous across multiple dimensions, but the understanding of the user always tended to be the computer scientists involved with the process. And it was interesting to see that the first social science done on internet use was actually done in the 1970s by a computer scientist on computer science doctoral students. I'm going to forget which of the UC institutions it was. I would have to call that naive social science. There is a difference in the training involved. So user practices were seen as a source of design problems. On the other hand, user groups have been influencing design decisions even from very early on. Early distinctions among types of users, benign versus the malicious. Of course, by 73, the network had already been brought down once by high school students. Concerns about technical insiders and outsiders. But this one is, I think, of particular importance from the human rights perspective. I was fascinated to see very early on the distinction between human users and demon users. The word demon is used in the RFCs. The concept of the demon comes from ancient Greece and then was used in the medieval period to refer to sources of agency, things that can act, that are neither human nor divine in nature. So in the internet context, that's software, it's layers of the network, it's operating systems, and the design process by technical people is oriented, in my reading, towards serving demons rather than human users, something for you all to think about. And there is now that RFC, it's about users. When humans were taken into account, it was often grudgingly. Although when humans needed to be taken into account, they found that it expanded the kinds of functions that were designed in ways that were useful for demons as well. There was a bemusement about human preferences. Can you believe it that humans want to be able to remember an internet address, a URL kind of thing? And concern that they couldn't stop humans from using things that actually were set up for the technologies to use. Uses, it's worth, many of you have been a part of the process for a long time, but I hear a lot of references to assumptions made about what people were thinking about in the early years. It was expected very early on that we would be using the internet in every domain of what we do socially. It was assumed that anybody who came onto the net to use it for one thing was inevitably going to go on and use it for other kinds of things. That was already vividly evident. They were aware that each technological innovation would bring new uses. A wide range of uses by government came up early on, including e-government in about 72. The weather system was the first one that they tried to deal with as a very complex and global problem. Commercial uses, again, discussed already in the early 70s, included this range. I decided to treat the design criteria as if they were policy principles. I was, in a sense, reading the RFCs as equivalent to constitutional documents. That wasn't original with me, but mapped onto my own research history, which does include reading massive numbers of Supreme Court decisions and so forth. So there were additional ones, but in terms of those that are particularly pertinent to human rights, design principles, design criteria that we can treat as policy principles from the first decade alone include user democracy, the effort to really serve all kinds of users, whether technical or not, whatever their interests, wherever in the globe. The phrase technological democracy is the phrase I'm using to refer to the desire to design not only for the fastest machines and the broadest band networks, but to the simplest machines and the slowest networks, which is a very important design criterion for human rights purposes. The desire to have telepresent, distant, and distributed computing, which is important in terms of equity of access to resources, access to information, and freedom of expression, and privacy as an enduring key concern. These are some of the human rights implications that I believe derive from, are suggested by these kinds of design criteria, and I think the HRPC for the provocation, I'll do some writing to address that direct translation, and I will be entering the text process within the RFCs on these kinds of points. Where does that leave us in terms of what's going on today? Privacy is still the most discussed human rights issue. It's widely recognized that the internet is fundamentally important for human rights, such as freedom of expression, and I laud the formation of the HRPC. But by now, I've been arguing this in the non-technical environment as well, but the rights of concern for you are socio-technical, not just technical. And by socio-technical, I mean that we are now living in a world, I actually think it's a moment of species change, but we're living, which is far shy of the singularity. There are moments of species change without going that far. So we are unable at this point in many ways to think about what's going on in social systems without thinking about what's going on in technical systems and vice versa. Your interest in the socio-technical rather than just the technical or just the social actually is, there's resonance with that on the legal side. So in the US, we began to see the legal decisions that were preferencing technological systems over social systems beginning in the 1980s, with a Supreme Court decision that preferenced what the national cable system needed over what the humans of Oklahoma wanted. We are seeing the evolution of robot law. We're about 10 years into serious thinking by legal scholars about how to develop law that treats robots even as legal subjects. This is of deep concern from a human rights perspective. I can identify this as a trend, but we need to think about then what it is to be human and what we need to protect in the human and how we can protect the human in what is no longer just a human environment, but a socio-technical environment. The technologies, yes, Marshall McLuhan, are extensions of us, but we aren't yet there in terms of understanding all of what that means for human rights. I've been trying to think about what the socio-technical is for those of you within the architecture and design community. And there's a sense in which you could say that the code is as the wood would be to a woodworker. And that's true. It's your material, the material that you work. But in your case, because it's all about mathematics, really your medium is complexity itself, human complexity itself. And that is the biggest challenge you could imagine humans ever being presented with. Code is law in the sense that it does have structural constitutive effect, but it's also not law in the sense that there's enormous variance across diverse autonomous systems and within subnetworks. It can be changed or affected by a lot of different kinds of entities. Middle boxes are your current issue, and politics still matters. So what I mean here is that when we make the law, we have the hope that it will provide general principles that will at least apply in a somewhat stable manner until we, in a reasoned and measured manner, decide to change those rules. In the code environment, things can change very quickly, whether by will and whether positively or through malicious goals. You can have sub-environments in which things operate very differently. But the bottom line is about politics, because whether or not information is leaked only matters if that information is used for repressive purposes. If no one's looking for me to throw me into jail because they don't like what I say about a president of the United States, then there is, in the abstract, a concern about information leaking. There might be commercial concerns if there's danger of financial harm, but a lot of it won't matter. What matters is the political will, and no matter what you do on the technical front, you aren't in the technical world alone going to be able to solve the problem of political will. My reading of the technical environment is that if working on the privacy problem, for example, is a whack-a-mole problem. With every new technology, you have the new issue of trying to prevent information leakage. That's going to keep on moving. You're never going to be able to stop that moving. And wherever you've put in a barrier, it will be possible to put in a workaround. So it's a never-ending process. Unfortunately, the law is not the law either, in the sense that whatever is in the text gets interpreted, gets implemented, and the question of whether or not evidence is even taken into account, our current issue in the U.S., let alone what kinds of evidence are used, really matter. You can get completely different outcomes from the same legal texts and the same legal systems. Germany saw that in the 1930s. The U.S. is going through that right now. And the law can change surprisingly quickly, as we are learning. So it is important to take human rights concerns into account during the design process from the bottom up. But I think that cross-training of legal and technical communities is absolutely essential. One of the primary motivations for my doing this research was to, at minimum, provide course materials for those required ethics courses in computer science departments that, as far as I have been able to tell, are largely taught by somebody you tackled on the sidewalk in front of the building and handed a book to that may or may not have had to do with ethics. I think that by reading in more detail than I'm able to offer you here today, I was hoping that internet designers would see the ethical issues in your own work. And I've mentioned several times what needs to happen on the legal side. But it still is going to be a political matter. And so I'm at the very edge of thinking about this, but I want to introduce the concept of a legal spandrel and a political spandrel. A spandrel is an architectural term that refers to an architectural feature that has been absolutely necessary at one point, but is no longer necessary, but we keep the form and use it for other purposes. The easy example in building architecture is the arch that goes over a doorway, which in early efforts to build arches, that triangle was needed in order to make the thing hold up. We learned more about engineering and no longer need that triangle, but we have kept that triangle for all kinds of aesthetic purposes. In my reading of what's going on with our national governments, much of what goes on in terms of how the structure looks, my line is much of how we talk about it, how we're taught about it, how the media talk about it is looking where the magician's hand is going and not where the game actually is. Those legal structures are often now spandrels being used for purposes quite other than those for which they were originally designed. And the same thing is true for many of our laws. Therefore, while we are certainly experiencing extremely important political moves by national governments, I'm not utterly convinced that those are matters of states as opposed to other kinds of entities, other kinds of associations and relationships. The opportunity that offers those of us who are also network citizens is to take advantage of autonomous systems and various kinds of independent and community-based networks to formulate new operating environments that do protect the human rights and values about which we are most concerned. I shared with someone before I started speaking that I am humbled by the question. I feel at this point that all I've done is walk up to the edge of the cliff, and all I can do is point to you and say, there's the cliff, jump over. But this is the cliff edge that we are all standing on together. These are the 8 publications that are so far out there. There are 2 more that are about to go out the door and another half dozen on the way. You can find, if you have anything you'd like to chat about, full text of many of the publications are up on the website. And if you're interested in the theoretical and conceptual frameworks within which I'm approaching this, there are other works as well. So thank you for your time.
I see nobody at the microphone. No questions? People are starting to come. I feel much better. Please remember to state your name as you begin.
Hi, I'm Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. Thank you for this presentation, but moreover, thank you for all the thinking that's clearly gone into it. I'm happy to see this connection between sociology, legal scholarship, and technical work. One of the things in your presentation mentioned jurisdictional issues, and I think that's something that we've been struggling with a lot in terms of how do we conceive of the work that we're doing. And I'm curious if you had any thoughts about network protocol design in general as a sort of lowest common denominator, given its ability to span jurisdictions, or as a homogenizing force, or what the implications are for protocol designers due to the cross-jurisdictional nature of our work.
I'm glad there'll be notes because I'm going to take these as provocations for further research, but I would, I like your approach to that. I would really point you, if you're curious about the very edge of the jurisdictional problem, I do think it's in the cybersecurity realm, where actually at this point states are saying, when I want to claim it's mine, I'll claim it, and when I don't want to claim exactly the same thing as mine, I won't claim it. That gives a lot of freedom in a certain sense. To the extent that we're concerned about laws of geopolitically recognized states, the jurisdictional issue is not going to go away, but the operational issues are moving very quickly.
Yeah, I'm John Levine, so I guess I'm going to ask the same question I always ask. If I look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it has 30 articles, and we've been talking primarily about privacy and freedom of expression, which is 2 articles. But there's 28 more, and in particular, there's one about freedom from attacks on, I forget, it's integrity and personal honor. Okay, which on the internet is a big thing, you know, and has some tension with freedom of speech and freedom of and privacy. And I never hear anybody talk about this. And so, while not at all minimizing the stuff that people that people do talk about, you know, if you look through, there's also freedom from arbitrary deprivation of property, you know, like fishing, you know. And I'm just wondering, you know, have you thought about all these other rights and the necessary tension when you have a whole lot of things that people want that can't necessarily all have at the same time?
So I am new to the HRPC. This is my first eruption within this group. So that's a question for the group, but I would agree with you that those matters should be included. One that I pointed to this week also is access to information. There was some pushback on that in terms of, does that mean everyone should have internet access? Actually, under US law, everyone should have internet access, whether at the community, even if it's at the community level rather than individual. So I would agree with you on the point.
Okay.
Hi, Stephen Farrell. So thanks again. I think this is quite interesting. If you were able to send some links to the mailing list about those kind of jurisdictional issues, I personally would find that quite interesting if you had a chance to do that later. So I had one kind of small question: is you kind of make us look very good. Did you not find anything that made you go, ugh?
I've been here for a week now.
Not necessarily this week, but in the RFC series.
Because I could, because my ability to analyze the technical decisions that I have been distressing was limited, that would have been where the concern came. What has been very interesting, you know, you guys are all about code, but if you step back in terms of the sociology of knowledge, you spent, you spend your time talking about texts and documents, not, in a sense, not about code. What has surprised me this week, so it's not within the text or within this research that I saw it, but I have been actually shocked this week by some of the conversations I've heard in which very fundamental legal and rights-related issues have been completely invisible to the designers, but so available that with one sentence, all of a sudden it was seen. So if it's one sentence away from visibility, why aren't these kinds of issues more at the front of the mind? And that's where I think we can make a difference educationally, but I hope also within the IETF.
Yeah, so I mean, I think if the people like yourself who've thought about the issues from those points of view could critique us as well as make us look good, I think that would be quite useful.
Of course, I didn't want to get thrown out of the room either.
David Lawrence, I want first one observation that there, even though there are a lot of people here that are very personally concerned with with accessibility issues and the elderly, it doesn't really show up in the RFC series of the IETF very much because we're concerned about making stupid computers talk to each other, and everything else is philosophically considered to be part of this presentation layer far above what we do. And so it's not a lack of concern for them. It's just that even when you have examples like RFC 4096 and the tagging spam in the subject header, even the issue there is, well, computers aren't going to make very simple sense of this, and anything else with trying to get humans to understand it is really kind of a problem beyond that.
No, I understand that, and actually, in reference to the preceding question, that would be my critique. The focus on demons rather than humans is a critique.
Right. But the question I actually got up for was, as you mentioned, it would really benefit everybody a lot if we could do some cross-training between the legal and the technical communities. And I'm curious what form you see that taking and how we can help facilitate that.
Just wanted to say that we're cutting the line with Andrew.
I think there's a need for courses and shared discourse environments, both of those kinds of things. The good news is that Harvard is beginning to think about taking some leadership. Other institutions have talked about it, so I think we're at a rising moment of interest in that. But no institution has yet stepped forward to say we're going to make this happen.
Hi, my name is Andrew Sullivan. So thank you for this. This is a great talk, and I've read some of your stuff before, but I guess I didn't realize about this site, so I'm excited to go and troll through it. You talked a little bit about the preference of the demon over the human, and you talked elsewhere about preferring the values of the network over human rights and so on. And I wonder if there's an interesting thing that's emerging here. I've been noodling about this a little while, so some of the people in the room might roll their eyes when they hear this again. But it seems to me that we're sort of something is emerging here that is a different system other than humans, that seems to have its own values. It seems to have something that is kind of independent of human rights and so on, and it has its own desires. And maybe McLuhan and those people sort of presage this, but this system is much more dynamic than maybe television and mass media were, and I'm just wondering whether there's whether what we're really facing is a sort of tussle between two kinds of cultural things, really the needs of the demons as opposed to the needs of the humans, and whether we're going to run into a kind of conflict here, much the way that the sort of dystopian analysis of potential robotic interests starts to rise. But like it seems to me that in some sense, we worry about robots, but we haven't really fully invented them yet. They're not really wandering around the way the androids are in the science fiction thing. But this thing's wandering around already, right? It's doing stuff. And I wonder if maybe what we've done is we've been distracted by the pretty pictures on the television of the androids, and we're not paying attention to the network and how that's going to change the notion of the rights of various agents. So I don't know if if that's part of the cliff that you were talking about before, or if that's something you've thought about. Thanks.
That's exactly what I mean by socio-technical rights as opposed to social or human rights. I use socio-technical rather than human technical because that word is out there in all kinds of environments. And so what I mean by species change, and the reference to McLuhan was about him thinking about technologies as extensions of us. And we're now in that world completely in a way that went far beyond what he thought about. But to me, it means we need to reconceptualize what we mean by human rights, given that they are so dependent on, it's easy to think about water and food, and those are still concerns. But now we have these other technological concerns as well that are part of who we are as a species at this point, differentially across the globe, yes, but But yes, I think that's exactly the intellectual and the political problem that we have. If I may make one last thought in reference to the slightly preceding, ask me a new question, I'm always slow. But one additional thing on the bringing of the legal and technical communities together is the translation work that you folks who are in this group, I think have a particular gift for. So I have to say thank you, Niels, for the amount that I have learned in terms of how to understand issues that you were discussing here this week from a human rights perspective. Having a translator was enormously important. So translation would be the third piece of that. Education, shared discourse communities, translation.
This is Allison relaying from Jabber. The person wrote, the current biggest threat to internet privacy and human rights are Google, FB, etc., and their business models. How do we fight that, and what can this group realistically do about it? And I think what the question is do you have a perspective on how we, from your thinking about the rights aspects of that?
Yeah, I do think that's where the law has an opportunity because in my view, we are going to be unable to constrain political actors with the law. They're going to do what they want to do, and that's why it's a political struggle, not a technical or a legal struggle. But when it comes to what corporations do, I would still like to believe that the law makes a difference. So that's where the battles are.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And I just want to say in the end that I'm hoping this isn't the last time we see you as part of this group, that having found us or having found you, that you'll continue to participate, because we obviously have a whole lot more to learn from you. Thanks.
And from a presentation about rights and the history here in Singapore, I'd like to switch over to Gisela in Mexico to present the recent changes to the draft on association. Gisela, are you there?
Yeah, hi. I'm here. Can you see me and hear me well?
Yeah, we hear you very well, and we see you in a upper corner.
Perfect.
There you are.
Is this better? Sorry, it's a little bit late at night over here. So yeah, essentially, as Neil said, and I think it's very pertinent regarding the questions that were being asked before. We've been working for more than a couple of months now on freedom of association and the internet infrastructure. Can you click the next one, please? So basically thinking about, it's not only about privacy and freedom of expression. It's not all rights are going to have a technical translation, but definitely most of them, to say from my perspective, will. Our research questions were these two. We first started just by analyzing the affordances of the internet architecture towards freedom of association and assembly. But when we started doing more and more research, we wondered if the internet itself was an association and what were the consequences of this in terms of international human rights law. So this is what I will be talking about a little bit today. Next, please. So it's important to say that as part of our methodology, we try to cover the most typical uses. It's not super exhaustive. And we tried focusing only at the infrastructure layer, and we did not cover the application layer at all, because it is the IETF indeed. Next, please. So just very quickly, international law protects collective expression, either ephemeral, temporal, or gatherings or organizations. The difference between assembly and association is merely a question of degree. One is association is more formal. Think about NGOs, think about unions, trade unions, whereas assemblies are gatherings, usually protests, sit-ins, these kinds of things. Next, please. What it is very important to stress out from international law is that what international law protects, it's actually the freedom to join an association. It actually, in international law, also says peaceful purposes. It is very interesting to delve into that because this has been abused, saying that some gatherings are not peaceful, therefore they are prohibited. I think it's very interesting to expand on this further on this draft. We haven't done so yet, but I would love to hear your comments about it. But back on the freedom aspect, it's very important because no one can be forced to either join, stay, or leave an association. It's exactly that, a freedom itself. Next, please. So the IETF itself, defined by RFC 3233 as an open global community of network designers, is an assembly itself and even an association if we take into account the rather formal nature of it. Next, please. RFCs are possible because of the collective expression that freedom of association and assembly allow, and even the word protocol found its way into the language of computer networking based on a need to just have an agreement among users, right? So just to give context and meaning to what association is, these are not merely words. These are things that have an impact on our daily lives as edge users, but also they have impacts on the IETF itself. So now we're wondering what impacts are these rights having on the internet architecture and vice versa, right? Next, please. So we mapped out a lot of cases and examples. I think it's not necessarily worth going through each and every one of them, but it's very interesting to approach these cases by thinking about the freedom perspective, because as I said, and I want to say it again, it is indeed a freedom. So reaching out, let me just go back. If we think about peer-to-peer, I will talk about this later in a couple of slides. Mailing lists are one of the first uses of the internet itself. All the discussion, the collective discussion that happens at the mailing list level. But let me concentrate on the forced association. We've been discussing on our own mailing list the implications of reaching out online and offline, and whether if there isn't an opt-out way, an opt-out mechanism for spamming or unrequested messages, could that be forced association? And then on the other hand, the denial of services attacks, that most of them, and especially lately, are done without the consent of the end users or even their knowledge. So this is forced association as well. And then recently we developed this argument about autonomous systems, because in order for edge users to connect to the internet, they need to pass through an intermediary that provides them the access to other networks. So for users to be able to join the network of networks, they have to connect and accept the policies of another system, and maybe they do not even consent with them or are not even aware of them. So we were thinking that this is also a form of forced association. And it is not trivial for an edge user to connect to this network of networks. I mean, not everybody has all this technical knowledge and privilege of free time to get onto this perspective itself. Next, please. Another question that was just cutting our research right through is, which model is better? Is it better for freedom of association at the infrastructure layer to be centralized or decentralized? Decentralized and resilience architecture, sure, they protect anonymity and privacy. But at the same time, centralized solutions also enable people to group together and reinforce identitary issues and make some groups more visible. So if we were thinking about standardizing either or, which one could be the better answer, or is there no better answer at all, which could also be a possibility. Next one, please. So there is a trend, definitely, especially at the application layer, of centralization and consolidation of hosting providers and internet access providers. So also the internet has become a central mediator for action and collaboration. I loved what Sandra just said about the social technical aspects. We're just completely intertwined. So this is just a quick example of what we were thinking, the advantages and disadvantages of having centralized peer-to-peer systems versus decentralized peer-to-peer systems. And do we know if one or the other are necessarily better, or maybe a hybrid system could actually enable freedom of association and assembly in a better way? Next, please. About version control. Version control is very widely used at the IETF and in the technical community through Subversion and Git, but there hasn't been any standardization on the IETF regarding that. So another question is why? Next, please. There are these two drafts that were brought up, I believe, a couple of years ago, but it's definitely a discussion that might be worth pointing towards and taking again to see what we can pull out from there and think about the human rights impact of these standardizations and drafts. So then we come to my favorite point. Is the internet itself an association or assembly, and what does this mean in terms of human rights? Next, please. If you think about it in the offline space, whether you are going to a pub or a protest, it's all about networks. It's all about the people you know and the people that the people you know in turn. So networks and associations, even at a linguistical level, are very closely related. Interconnected groups and assemblies of people, they depend essentially on this. We are all linked, either, again, offline or online. So if the internet is an association, does this mean that every network is an assembly so they can implement their own rules, say, censor anything they want because they have that protection itself? Or do we have to give more importance to a larger assembly, the network of networks, that prevails over all the other smaller ones? We discussed this back and forth several times. Next, please. And we did conclude that the internet, well, we dare to conclude, I would love to discuss this further, but I just love this idea because I think it could take us to really interesting consequences. If the internet is made up of interconnected autonomous systems, then that is an association and an assembly itself. So even if they are private autonomous systems, they have public consequences. So they have to be subject to certain rules. And maybe the framework of the right to freedom of association and assembly can give those set of rules and further enable more and more rights that go even beyond association and assembly. So if the internet is an association, it should be protected as such. And as I said, all the other rights that stem from that should be protected as well. Next, please. So yes, the internet impacts the ability of people to exercise their freedom, special emphasis again on freedom of assembly and association. And the internet itself is a form of assembly and association and should be protected as such. We still have to figure out much more technical details and how these two worlds are going to combine if we dare to say that it is indeed an association. And finally, is this ready to be adopted by the research group? So that's my questions for you. And I hope we can disagree, debate, or comment on this further on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I want to, as the line starts to develop and before we get to the adoption, I wanted to just see a quick hand show of the people who have read this draft. Fairly good. Okay, thanks. More more than I would have counted. Okay, I'll go to the line. Please make sure you give your name as you start to speak.
Sandra Brayman, Texas A&M University. Thank you, Gisela, for taking us down this path. I see that you and I have actually come to the same position regarding an interest in autonomous systems as one place where politics may be going. But permit me to offer some critiques because I'm concerned about the definitional foundations of your work and would hate the whole effort to fail on the definitional problem. So I don't know a lot about how freedom of association has been treated in international law, but a quick search shows it was largely used, it developed out of labor concerns, labor organizing. But in U.S. law, where that language comes from, assembly is, and of course there is always a difference between legal definitions and common sense definitions. You're relying on common sense, common usage definitions. Assembly in U.S. law has to do with physical gathering. Association does have to do with formal relationships in an organization. Side point, but an important one, something to consider as you go further with this, would be that one of the important elements of freedom of association in U.S. law is the right to be anonymous within the association. That is, the government can't come and ask you who your members are. But it does require the formal relationships. So a thief breaking into your house or a DDoS attack is not considered an association. It doesn't meet the requirements. And nor do social networks. Those kinds of relationships meet the requirements of association. So I think that was some further refinement of the fundamental concepts so that they map onto legal definitions will make this much stronger.
Yeah, definitely. That's an amazing point. We actually try to get the international jurisprudence to get it's much more abstract. Actually, the US is one of the countries that has more jurisprudence on the right to freedom of association and assembly, also regarding free speech. And we discussed a lot also about like, who are you? And this is beautiful in the US jurisprudence as well. I'm Mexican, so I'm not an expert on US jurisprudence whatsoever. So, but who do you have the right to discriminate if you have an association or not? And what we did find, and we could make, we made a combination in taking international law as our main standard, was that even though it might be true that an assembly is a physical gathering, we went with the definition of a temporary gathering, a more ephemeral one that is crystallized in international law. Also, because it has been recognized that online and offline rights are should be applied in the same way. But I thank you for this, because I do believe we kind of maybe took it for granted. So making it more explicit and giving it way more legal background could make it stronger. So thanks for this.
Yes, and if I can permit one follow-up, your argument about assembly is a very good one. It would deserve journal article length treatment in its own to make that argument as a necessary step to make sure your readers are understanding what you're saying. But on the association side, I think that the treatment of those relationships within social networks and so on is still going to be very difficult to defend, and it will undermine people's reception to your work.
Thank you. Two things. Cut the line after Andrew. And also, I have a request from our scribe. People are speaking very quickly. So if there are others that can help add to the scribing Etherpad as time goes on, that would be very welcome. Please go ahead.
Dan Harkins, and I'll try and speak slowly. Can you go back a couple of slides? Yeah, this one. So when I think I was the only person to speak out against forming this research group when it came up.
But you were also the first one to implement human rights considerations in a draft.
Yes. And some of my fears, I think, are realized by this slide. Now, what I was upset about when this group was being formed is people were talking about rights as kind of political rights, and it ignores the kind of rights that Locke called the laws of nature. And these are like liberty rights and claim rights that are not granted by an organization, and they're not, bestowed upon people for some societal good. these exist just because we're human beings. And one of those is the right to association. And as a claim right and a liberty right, there are no obligations that I must hold up to practice my right of association. And furthermore, the idea that my rights of association should be protected means that there's some group that has granted me my right to association and assembly. And the fear there is that, something that's big enough to give me these rights is big enough to take them away. And, we don't really care about that kind of problem when the party we like is in power, but when the party we don't like is in power, we become neo-civil libertarians. So I kind of have a problem with the fact that, my rights to assembly and association are now being suborned to some agency that will give them to me. And I'm also concerned that since things that are private have public consequences. So again, this is sort of like an obligation that is being imposed upon my liberty and claim rights, which I object to. And that which is private for me, and nobody has a claim to that, provided that I'm practicing my liberty and claim rights. So this is the kind of stuff that I was worried about. I do think that the internet is an assembly and an association, but I am alarmed at the consequences that this group is following from that observation.
Gisela, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think it's definitely it's not a black and white issue. I do believe that even though you have a right to association, there are limits on every right. Freedom of expression is easier to talk about, but there are certain limits of assembly and association as well. Non-discrimination, they have to do with hate speech as well, right? Because at the end, they are also free speech issues. It's collective expression that these rights are protecting. And I do think that we need to delve deeper in the consequences of accepting this premise, and in what terms are we going to accept this premise. I don't know if Niels wants to add something to that.
I think that we should not think that a right includes necessarily an authority to implement it. There is such a thing as distributed governance, which can also uphold rights. So even an absolute right doesn't mean an absolute authority to enforce it, which is a problem in upholding the rights. But I think your fear that if we say it is an association and therefore there are these rights, that doesn't mean we automatically establish an organization to police it.
Well, my fear is the word private there, that frightens me. Obligations, that frightens me, and should be protected. By whom? Now, I know you're not establishing some group, but you're suborning my rights to these. You're not treating my rights that are as law called the laws of nature. You're not treating them as that. You're treating them as political rights or contractual rights, which are only legitimate if we have liberty rights and claim rights. The only way that you can have a legitimate political right, like the right to healthcare or the right to a good job, the only way you can have that be legitimate is to have respect for claim rights and liberty rights. And by not recognizing assembly and association as a claim right or a liberty right is, I think, the wrong direction.
Hi, my name is Andrew Sullivan. I think I also have some concerns about this slide and some of the related language in the draft, but maybe not based on the natural rights claims that we just heard. I'm afraid I'm with Bentham on those. Nevertheless, I think there is a problem, and it's almost a definitional problem. I think one of the difficulties that you have here is that you're treating the internet as a count noun. And that proper name, the internet, is not really a count noun. It's a mass noun. The word the internet, when it's got a capital I on it, is more like the term traffic than it's like the term the cup. And and so the intranet, in that sense, is an emergent and sort of process-driven thing that emerges from the collection of all these ASs that happen to be getting together at any given time. So the reason that that word autonomous is in the term autonomous system is because they really are independent networks. They're independent things that wander around and they do stuff apart from one another. And the fact that they happen to interact at any given time is an emergent property that comes from the fact that they happen to use the same protocols that we've defined here at the IETF and that other people have defined and so on. If that's the case, then the obligations that are in the last bullet there just don't happen. That is, the ASs that happen to be exchanging at any one time, they have obligations to one another because they've asserted them. That is, by using a given protocol, they've asserted the obligations that come from using that protocol. But the fact that they don't happen to implement some other protocol or refuse to interoperate with some other AS on the internet is not a problem. That's not a failure of their obligation. And that's because the intranet doesn't have a complete end-to-end thing from every edge to every edge. Instead, the intranet is, it's amorphous at the edges, and that's okay. That's actually part of the definition of it. And I think that if you embrace this version of the intranet, it's more like a cloud or traffic or something like that, then you don't have this ability to say, well, these obligations stem from this, because in any given bilateral interaction on the internet, the obligation might be there, but it's not a transitive property that carries across the entire internet. That seems to me to be a deep conceptual problem that's in the draft right now, and I'm not sure that you've addressed it. And that seems to me to be the place where I have the greatest concern about the way this draft goes, because I think the way you framed it entails that there are these obligations, and I don't believe that that's consistent with the definition of the internet that I believe is the true one. Thanks.
Thank you. Gisela, any last, in response or last comment on that?
Yeah, I just, I thank you for this. This is also, well, just defining the internet itself, as Sandra said, could be a whole research paper itself. I just want to make a very quick note on, it's very different and regarding both comments. And I think it's very different to say, let me just put a very brief example. The door is shut. The door will be shut, or the door should be shut, or should be closed. So if we say should, it doesn't mean that it's happening in reality, and it doesn't mean that it's happening at a physical level. It just means that it's a normative level that could embrace further protection in cases of human rights violations. So it's just thinking about that. Like, I just want to put that in. Also I took notes on everything that Joseph said, so we could further research it and incorporate it into our draft, because I think there's more work to do regarding this. So thanks again for the great comments.
Okay, thank you. On the research group adoption of it, that requires sort of a transform from sort of you and Niels owning the change rights to the group. And if it's okay, I'd like to take that question to the list as opposed to trying to decide it here at this point, if that's, fine with the two of you. I think it's a good discussion. I'm not sure that the group's ready. And as I say, there's that transform in sort of the ownership of the words once it does become a group. So make sure you really want what you're asking for. So thanks. Okay, thank you. Okay, so moving on to the next one. So I'll be asking that question on the list about adoption. So the next one is draft sent over HRPC political 02. And that's...
will be presented by Amelia Andersdotter, who has become a co-author on this draft. And here you got the powers that be.
Right, so good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming here. I've been making some changes to the text in this document that I will be presenting. But so the rather ambitious scope of this document is to answer the question of whether protocols are political. It goes through different schools of thoughts on the relationships between standards and specifications and moral choices, and the possible implications thereof on the IETF. Normative effects of IETF RFCs are already recognized by and through the RFCs. We've seen a couple of presentations here today that show that over time, the IETF addresses moral, even legal and ethical implications of their work, and that this in fact has a bearing on where the protocols end up. So there are some RFCs where this is made very explicit, such as in the IETF mission statement, RFC 3935 from 2004, where it explicitly says that the IETF prefers decentralized and open architecture where many different entities can come and collaborate. But there are also some examples where the morality of a specific standard develops over time, such as in the case of the hypertext transfer protocol, where in the 1990s, some very strong privacy concerns were expressed in the RFC, which were then later converted into a kind of balancing or trade-off between privacy concerns and possible uses of, say, referrers for security monitoring of networks or websites. I've also taken an interest this week in the Secure Telephone Identities Research Group at the IETF, which appears to be constructed with a specific intention of addressing robocalling that appears to me an American problem. Being from the European Union, I have never heard of this being an issue in any of the member states, and normally we have legislation in place that stops companies from harassing people over phone. And so there are these cases in the IETF where this community embarks on missions to protect individuals from inconveniences or problems that may only actually arise in certain legal systems, but not in others. The changes that I made in the text since the last IETF meeting normally concern competition and collaboration. So going over what are the typical challenges faced by standards associations, how are they financed, how do you get a lot of people in the same place to agree, and also whether standards associations face problems with legal problems such as in competition law in different parts of the world. There's been some renumbering of different sections in the document. In section 9, that was formerly section 10, I've made the drastic decision to remove references to the IETF not being a protocol police, because I think that kind of language is just a bit silly, because also we would not specify that, for instance, ducks don't bark or other things that are self-evident. As a voluntary standards association, the IETF clearly does not police anything in general. But that said, the IETF does engage in work that causes policing to occur in other places in the world. So I know a couple of jurisdictions where TLS or DNSSEC have actually made it into enforceable policies. So even if the IETF does not do that, somebody else does. And this could be a reason for the IETF to consider the effects of the standards that they make and how they want to take them technically, in which direction they want to take that. In section 10, which was formerly section 11, there's a discussion on the normative effect of political standards and the need for the IETF community to reflect upon those. That ties back into the changes that I made in section 9. Because as long as the IETF standards are something that you envisage to be used in a wide range of different communities and possibly even mandated in public procurement procedures by government and so forth, these things do have normative effects. And even if you can't change the way that any particular enforcing agency deals with your standards, you could at least reflect upon what would be the effects of building your protocols in one way or the other. That said, one of the questions that we're meant to be discussing here is whether this should be adopted as a draft. I believe, and also upon hearing the discussions from the earlier presentations in this group, that it would be useful to have considerably more discussion in the group. We need participation from more individuals with different views of what politics is or could be, what the engagement of this community should be with political processes in that case, and how the standards that you develop interface with them. We could be looking closer at different situations where IETF standards have made it into enforceable policies in different parts of the world. I think that would be useful for this community maybe to know also what the impact is that you've actually had on people when they engage in their daily tasks outside of this forum. There's clearly some semantics that needs to be worked out as well. We've had discussions here about natural rights. And about the interpretations of specific concepts under American law. I am not from the US, and so for me the natural rights discussion, as well as the legal interpretation of terms under American law, is a bit abstract. It's not natural to me, and I'm not often confronted with the American ways of dealing with legislation. So I would be extremely happy if we could have a broader discussion about that in this community, and if more people would like to interface with me or with other people in the research group about how a community like the IETF could or should reflect even upon the very semantics of what it is that it means to have politics and standards. And so that's my short debriefing, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. While waiting for the line, could I also see a show? Okay, you wanted to clap? Okay. While waiting, I'd like to see a show of hands again on the number of people that have read this one. Okay, a few less than the other. And I'll just say up front that I'm going to also take the discussion on turning it into a group draft to the list. And while we've been talking about the whole complexity of a research group draft, and ownership and responsibilities became a second order question, which I'll also take to the list as opposed to doing here. So please, I think that he came first at the back, and then, yeah, please remember to say your name.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Adrian Farrell, and I guess in this room, I'm Pirate Party UK. Thank you for this work. I'd like to encourage you to remain interested in robocalls. Robocalls are a curse in some member states of the EU, despite legislation, because the internet has actually enabled bypassing the legislation.
I don't know the situation in the UK, but I can speak for, I've never heard about this being a problem in Sweden, and certainly not to the extent that it is a problem in the US. It was what I meant.
David Lawrence, I don't have a well-formed thought on this, but I'm kind of wondering, since you mentioned the comparing and contrasting the EU way of thinking about some things versus not really knowing the American way of thinking about things, well, we certainly have a very heavily Western bias in internet standards as a whole. It makes me wonder about what kind of outreach and drawing in we can do for people that don't necessarily have that social organization system, like individualists versus collectivists. What might, say, the Japanese perspective on it be, not just what's the US perspective in addition to the EU. And like I said, I don't really have any targeted thoughts on that, but just kind of like, other than to think that we should be expanding it beyond this Western concept, but how does all of the stakeholders in the internet participate?
Thanks. I want to cut the line where it is now, but thank you.
Hi, Stephen Farrell. So again, I'm not sure what I think about this one, as I think I said on the list. But I think there could be something good here in terms of describing, but the abstract says it seeks to answer the question whether protocols are political, I think, right? I think that's a bad idea. Certainly now, maybe after a bunch of work has been done, we'll discover that it is, even worth thinking about answering that question, but I think it probably isn't. Whereas some of the information gathering and kind of analysis might be useful.
Kyle Rose. The overwhelming feeling that I get from the session this morning is that a lot of the terminology that we're using here is kind of, there are not agreed upon definitions for a lot of these things, or at least not precisely enough, right? And so the word rights, for instance, winds up being a Rorschach test, and it's whatever you happen to see in it, whatever your preconceptions are, you're going to then apply to the text. I'm not entirely sure how to solve that problem, because that's a lot of this is cultural, but without that level of precision, I'm not sure that we're gonna be able to make. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to have policies that have the same meaning to everyone reading them.
If I can intercede on that one. In both the RFC that just came out and in this draft, there is an attempt to define what we mean by the words. Now, we can then argue over those definitions, but we have been doing that definitional part, because you're very right. For it not to be a Rorschach test. Rorschach test. Thank you. Yeah. We do need to put down definitions, and we do need to discuss them, and so that is part of what's being done.
Well, right, but then you're going to get disagreement on the validity of the definitions as well,
that's
right?
true.
And so it's, especially like the word right is really loaded, and as was demonstrated before, it has very different meanings potentially even within different communities in the United States.
Understood.
Right? So, I come from a civil libertarian background, right? And so rights to me are very expansive and not endowed by organizations, right?
I do not want to pull an IETF tactic here, but saying we have already discussed this at length.
I missed the last couple.
But where the discussion then ended, which doesn't mean we can't change it, is that we used the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Social, Cultural, and Economic Rights, because they're the most universal norms that have been internationally adapted and pretty much signed and ratified by all countries in the world.
And they are all consistent with each other.
Well, but on that high level, it's the most broad set of norms that the world seems to agree on. So that was the outcome of the discussion then. But
okay.
And we can always go back to discussing it on the list, but we do have a stake in the ground on it. Did you have anything final that you wanted to add after the questions?
No, I think this is a discussion that needs to be taken to the emailing list.
Yep.
So that we can share more thoughts. I think the semantic problems of how you define rights in different cultures, as well as the point that we need to bring in more the Asian participants in the IETF into these discussions are very valid. And we will be working towards that goal in the upcoming months. So thank you all for your questions and participation.
Thank you. And yeah, I keep forgetting the applause part. Thank you all for reminding. I just wanted to mention that just because something hasn't been adopted as a research group, project, or document does not mean we can't discuss it in great and gory detail on the list. So please, you're all invited to continue these discussions there. Okay, the next one is draft unrequested. No, it's not. Oh, it's anonymity. Sorry. And the speaker for anonymity, yes, please.
Hello. I prefer to have a slave that I can tell. Next slide, please. Okay, now. Okay, so you probably noticed that there was a new version of the anonymity draft which was published beginning of the week, so a bit late for everyone to read it. The first version of the anonymity draft was extremely short, and the new one is much expanded. So if you have read 00, please forget it and read 01. What's the problem with anonymity? It's that unlike what many people are saying, for instance, when some people in the law enforcement say that because of encryption, they are going dark, they can no longer see what's going on. It's quite the opposite, actually. By default, a lot of data is produced. I mean, if we do nothing, if we just follow the ordinary path of digital networks, a lot of data is produced, and Internet improves surveillance. Not only allows it, but improves it. So, up to now, there have been not a lot of anonymity work at IETF. These documents are important because, for instance, 6235 is about anonymization of data, which is a touchy subject. 7844 is a good example of a protocol that, by default, without thinking bad, by default, the protocol, DHCP in that case, was really good for surveillance and very bad for privacy. And it took a conscious effort on a lot of work to make a protocol, to turn DHCP into a protocol which is better for privacy. So do we need a general document about anonymity? That's a big issue. A big problem when you talk about anonymity is terminology, because there is no really standard terminology. Even if there is one, people don't understand it or sometimes don't agree on the definition. And anonymity is a very loaded term. A lot of people talk about it. For instance, if you take the announcement yesterday of the new DNS public service Quad 9, it was not in the official press release, but a lot of people talking about Quad 9 were mentioning anonymity, saying that it's good that Quad 9 promised to anonymize the data they collect about people, this sort of thing. But most of the time, anonymity is used in a very approximative meaning. And we will certainly have a lot of things to discuss about terminology. I mean, anonymity has been discussed a lot already outside of IETF, so we should not reinvent the wheel, we should be modest. But on the other hand, the result of all these discussions outside of the IETF is, in some respects, a big mess, where it's quite difficult to find out what's going on. For instance, the difference between anonymity and pseudonymity is still not very clear, even in people who participate in organizations like IETF. So there is also a more political discussion about should we promote, allow anonymity. It's on one side, anonymity is very often seen as something bad, for instance, by law enforcement or by other people who say, if we have anonymity, trolls will be able to troll freely without fear of reprisal, this sort of thing. But to stick with IETF matters, anonymity can also be seen as a problem for operation people. For instance, in the case of DHCP that I mentioned, RFC 7844, if we don't know that the same machine is going back, it may make things more difficult. For instance, when you want to know the number of unique visitors that there are on your Wi-Fi networks. So operation people may think that anonymity is a problem. This is something probably to address. We don't make documents just for the pleasure of writing documents. One of the goals of HRPC is also to be actually helpful to IETF work. So will it be possible to provide practical advice? Because if the document is only to say that anonymity is good and to give a definition, maybe it's not worth the time. So one of the questions we have to ask is, can we really provide practical advice? There are a few ideas in the current draft. So the document version 01 is out. As I said, forget about 00, which was just a beginning. Please read it, comment it on the mailing list, and maybe adopt it for future work or to merge with other documents, I don't know. So thank you, and any remarks, questions, etc.
Thank you. A couple things. One, could I see hands again on the number of people that have read the 01 draft? Yeah, you would have read it.
Hope so.
Okay, so more people do need to read this one, but please.
Hi, Alptoga Netbox. So you've raised some very good points there. I was interested on the implementation question, I suppose. So you said that there's a lot of research here, but it doesn't always make its way into the specifications. How do you think we can perhaps bridge that? Is there a way we could make this work more visible in the implementation space? Do you think we could try harder to do that?
I think it will be the same for all the other documents. Now that we have done something, we have RFC already, 8280. I think that the next step for HRPC, the most important one, would be now to go to the working groups and then to spot drafts where there are unnoticed human rights issues and to engage with protocol authors about that. And anonymity is just one example among others, but in many drafts, for instance, people are using, well, less now, but at a time in the IETF, it was normal to use persistence identifier for everything, which are good for surveillance and bad for anonymity. Now I think that most working groups now know that it's a bad practice, but most is not all. And still the problem continue to come on from time to time.
I'm John Levine. I have grave reservations about this draft. I think the reality is while there is certainly some anonymous speech that's important, the vast majority of anonymous speech on the internet is malicious or worse. And this draft could easily be a gift to people who want to point at the IETF and say that we're a bunch of wacko libertarians. And I would like to look really hard at issues of when do people need anonymity versus a pseudonym versus other approaches to allow people to speak freely while still retaining, every time I stand up here, I talk about attacks on personal honor. And I think something, for this to be credible and this to be useful, we need to address the tension between anonymous speech and bad things that people do with anonymous speech, and ways to weigh the consequences back and forth, and to mitigate the damage and try to get the benefits without basically all of the bad stuff that you get if you do it in a naive way.
That's something that will happen for every human rights. No, for instance, this has been discussed a lot in the context of encryption. So it's also a problem for anonymity. I think that RFC 8280 has already some provisions about the fact that human rights are not absolute, and any good thing can also bring bad things. So yes, anonymity can bring problems, but is it up to us to address it? I mean, do you suggest that we find ways to have access to anonymous data, or to de-anonymize?
Not necessarily, but I'm saying, and anonymity is a very narrow thing, like the difference between being anonymous and being pseudonymous is kind of vague, and a lot of what is traditional, like the classic example of anonymous speech is the Federalist Papers in the United States, which were pseudonyms, and everybody knew who they really were. So I would like to say, yes, there are places where anonymity is important, but there are also places where anonymity produces bad results for human rights. And when you're looking at anonymous speech, look at other approaches that can provide the similar practical benefits, and encourage people to weigh the costs of what they do along with the benefits. I'm not saying, I'm from the U.S. where, we have a constitutional right to anonymous speech. I'm not opposed to it. I just think we too quickly leap to say privacy and anonymity here without properly weighing all of the other costs that we impose on people.
That's an important point. And what I would say that today, the biggest problem I see with digital networks is that by default, they produce a lot of that data and they break anonymity. So I have nothing against explicit identification. For instance, if you go to Facebook, to the Onion web server of Facebook, allowing you to go anonymously to Facebook, after that you are identified. So Facebook knows everything about you as before. But
we all agree Facebook is evil. No problem there.
No. But my point wasn't that. My point was, in my opinion, we should make a network which is as possible anonymous by default, and then some services may require identification. GitHub or Facebook or the IETF data tracker requires identification. But the problem today with the internet is that you are identified by default. So there is no way to be anonymous in practice.
We have a lot of discussion to do.
Right, and that's exactly what I was going to suggest. First of all, I want to cut the line, but then also it looks like a really good discussion to have further on the list. And cutting the line here, also saying that we'll have to be a little bit quicker, since I've been a terrible co-chair and I've let time be used in wonderful conversations without sticking to a tight schedule. So please go ahead.
Stephen Farrell speaking quickly. Apologies to the note taker. And I think having the discussion time, actually, I think I prefer personally. I have some sympathy with John on this one. I think another aspect of why anonymity is difficult as a goal is because it can be very, very hard, especially in protocols. And if you were to ask somebody to kind of change their protocol to support something like k-anonymity or other flavors of anonymous kind of technical things, they are quite often going to be way too hard to be acceptable. So I think the definitional thing will be an interesting discussion. It's not clear to me that anonymity is actually the right goal that we want for most protocols. I think it's something like it, but not quite anonymous. But we'll see when we talk about it.
Yeah, indeed, it's not in the current draft, but yet there is not only a problem for the operation people, it's also possible that integrating anonymity into a protocol may be very difficult or very costly for the protocol. Yes, it's not in the draft today. It should.
Thank you. See, this time I started the clapping. Okay, I'm going to ask, Niels is basically going to talk about the next two, the unrequested and the guidelines. So I'll turn the mic over to Niels, and you could stay up here, or you can go a little bit.
Down with the people.
Up with the pink box, yes.
So this was another failed attempt of me to satisfy Stephen Farrell. And I think we already discussed at the list that I'm going to structurally fail at that. So I'll probably try something new. But seriously, what we tried here was to see whether it would make sense to take part of the discussion that we had in the process in RFC 80-80 about DDoS attacks, and saying that DDoS attacks are bad, not just because they're an attack on the network, but also from a human rights angle, sticking that in a draft, whether that would make sense, and also add some stuff on spam and unsolicited comments is a discussion we had with Stefan as well. If we put it in a draft, it didn't really look like it has a proper target audience, probably doesn't make a lot of sense. If no one thinks it makes sense and everyone agrees, then it'll just go and die on the data tracker, which is totally fine. Also because most of that text is in other documents. So if no one has a problem with that dying, I'll continue to the next draft, which is pretty much just taking the guidelines from RFC 80-80, and I stuck them in a new draft for two reasons. In the discussions on RFC 80-80, the first one to mention was Elliot Lear, was to take the considerations and put them in a separate document to make it more practical for people to use them. We didn't do that by the time because the guidelines were a conclusion from the research, but now we are doing the research. Now we have that that early hypothesis or the early research. And now we're going to try to apply it. I expect that the guidelines will change. And in this process, I already came up with some changes based on the work of Stefan. But I think the points that John Levine made might also add further consideration. So this is like a working document in which we can improve and work on the implementation of the guidelines. And once we feel really comfortable with it, maybe we could throw it over the wall or push it on somewhere or the other.
Thank you. Any comments? I think that was fairly clear. And if not, I'll just move on. And it's basically an active document and open for comment. I have a question of our AD, which is, we are within 10 minutes of ending. There's nothing on after us anywhere, as far as I can tell. And are we in trouble if we, for whoever's willing to stay, sort of creep on a little bit into other time? If you just shake your head, I can say, you said, no, it's okay, and we can creep on. If any of the technical support or anyone else have a reason why we have to stop, please let us know. Understandable if some of you will have to leave, but we have a fair amount left, and if I can continue going through it, I think that would be good. We're having some good discussions, etc. So, okay, thanks. Our next thing is the errata to RFC 7725, plus draft new protocol elements 451, plus human rights consideration.
Yeah, this work builds on the hackathon work of last time, about which you can also read in the IETF journal. But there's ongoing work which has been partly presented in the HTTP working group, hackathon work, and also other documents about which Shivan will enlighten us. Shivan, go ahead.
Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Shivan, and thanks, Niels. That might be too much. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So yeah, I'll be talking about the work we did at the hackathon this last weekend, and also the feedback that we got from HTTP-based working group and also other people about draft new protocol elements. Yep. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'll do that. So at the hackathon, Stefan submitted an errata to RFC 7725, and we also worked on different like drafts related to the research group. Yeah, and Alp and I also worked on the browser extension and the block collector from the previous hackathon. So the feedback that we got on Monday was that So Martin Thompson mentioned that for the geographical scope that we're proposing in draft new protocol elements, we might want to keep it as a link header instead of like we were considering an alpha 2 country code, but maybe perhaps a link to an explicit document that specifies the geographical scope at a more granular level than just a country code might be more useful. Perhaps the downside is that this will add complexity, because now whoever's implementing the status code would have to maintain and upload a document. And we also got some feedback from Mark Nottingham on how to move forward. I'll talk about this in a second. Sandra brought up an interesting point. So right now, as RFC 7725 defines it, the reason for the block must be should be in the response body. But given that the whole point is to increase transparency around the block, should we change it to a must? Like should we say that you must specify the reason in the response body? So I corresponded with Tim Bray about the original author of RFC 7725 as to why he put it must, as to why he put should, and he said it didn't really come up in the discussion at all, and it was just something he went with initially, and it was just accepted. So maybe that's worth talking about. Is that something you want to propose as well? There was some discussion about the word censorship on the mailing list. I think perhaps also you could talk about that and what word we want to be using when we talk about this in the drafts. I said that my personal opinion is that we should be using whatever RFC 7725 says, which is not legally withheld, as Andrew Sullivan pointed out. And also Sandra said that maybe we want to have a section on legality when we talk about the human rights considerations of this status code. So moving forward, perhaps we want to be, we want to take new protocol elements draft and make it informational and add a section on human rights considerations based on RFC 8280. So I think this is probably the best way to move forward. And if anyone has feedback on this, that'd be great. And that's it. Some links. Yeah, please.
Yeah, Toka. So there's a problem with trying to put the reason in the body. That would mean it can only be used for basically HTML, whereas we want this to be used for images, GIFs, which probably can't be edited in flight. So technically, I think it's basically impossible to require must for that point. So it might have to go in the headers, the reason for the block, which is another technical challenge. But yeah.
Ben Schwartz. On the topic of country code, I think if we want to argue that country code is not sufficient, it would be really helpful to have an example of a case where content takedowns have actually happened on the internet on a level below the country level. That seems.
I think yes, we did some research on this. Alp can maybe talk to it, but I think most of the blocks we saw were on a country level, which is why we wanted to keep an alpha 2 country code. But
yeah, I'm not aware of any blocks that have happened on a sub-country level. No, there are blocks that happen on the basis of even civil suits from individuals. But I think a country code still applies there. That individuals, at least within a country, it's unambiguous, even if it's incomplete.
It was mentioned that perhaps, like in recent examples with Spain, like if there's a region that would perhaps be relevant to this, that perhaps that's an example.
Mic line is cut.
This is Ulrich Wisser. I think we could make it a must, but as this is in the body and we really don't have any technical specifications for what goes in there,
right.
If they really don't want to give a reason, they will just write no reason given.
I agree.
And that's kind of give it no purpose at all. So I don't see really how a must will help at all.
Given the fact that it's also completely voluntary, right? Like there's no must anyway, so perhaps.
Right. Just on the question of the country code and the granularity, I believe that there has been an attempt before. I don't remember the RFC from memory to actually implement geographic blocks based on geocoding within the header that would allow geographic blocks to be propagated and even cached using the HTTP caching system. I think that didn't work out, so I would caution against anything beyond jurisdiction, national level granularity. It's also a question of what do you want to support and what do you want to legitimize in a way. I think this idea that, hey, this country wants to do something like that, let them do it. But if they want to start doing things like blocking cities and sub-regions, then that's really something that's unsupportable within the framework of human rights protocol considerations.
I'm not sure about that. I feel like the purpose of this should be to give implementers of the block, allow them a mechanism to give transparency around this. So I think, I mean, it's a different discussion, I guess, like what we want to legitimize or not, but I don't think we, I view it more as much transparency around this as possible.
Thank you. Two thoughts. Just wanted to share why I argued for must. I don't know of a government in the world that's inviting trouble, but most governments that we consider legitimate always tell you why they are stopping you from doing something. It may be a bullshit reason, it may be not the real reason, but they have to tell you something. And that matters from the user's perspective if you want to seek redress. And I'm interested in this because of the opportunities it could give for redress by individuals and by governments. By entities that are trying to change actually what governments are doing. So since this is a hinge between the technical system and the legal system, you want to incorporate how each of those operates, and in the legal world, you give the reason why something is being blocked. So if in the ideal world, we're moving towards this being a requirement rather than voluntary, must would have to be a part of that. And I would also like to see something about redress, some discussion of that. The second point I wanted to make is that really we want to distinguish, you've already moved to the distinction between who's doing the blocking and the jurisdiction that justified the blocking, or the source of the law or regulation that justifies the blocking. But the third thing would be the geographic, not just at the subnational level, but because so many countries are trying to exercise their law extraterritorially outside their geopolitical borders.
So wouldn't if you do decide to go with the country code, do you think that'd be towards something like what you're saying, like defining?
Yeah, it would just be, so it's another reason to be adding that. How you deal with the subnational, I'm not sure, but at least I would, all three of those, who, which jurisdiction, and where.
I agree.
Thank you. I think another good one to take to the list, especially since I did cut one person who wanted to come to the microphone from doing so. So hopefully we can continue on the list. Next one is update on progress on human rights considerations, and Sunil
is in Bangalore and presenting remotely. So Sunil, have we got you? Hi, Sunil.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. And Sunil, what Sunil has done is that he has been trying to apply the guidelines from RFC 8280 to the OAuth framework. So, Sunil, please take it away.
Thanks, Niels. Could I have the next slide, please? So, before I get started, I just wanted to display on the slide the list of people who have helped me with this work, and also to perhaps make a qualification, which is I have zero legal and technical training. So I'm just a charlatan in front of you. If there are lots of mistakes, the fault is mine, and if there is anything valuable, the credit goes to the list of gentlemen and the lady on this list. Next slide, please. So what has been done is we've looked through the RFCs and some of the IETF documentation done on blogs and also news websites. We've listened to the video recordings of the IETF meetings, and we've also surveyed some amount of academic literature. What we haven't managed to do so far is look through the mailing list archives completely. And what we'd like to do is interview members of the working group and complete the analysis of academic papers and perhaps have the consideration document reviewed by members of the working group because before we start sharing on the mailing list, and also perhaps write a blog on our experiences doing this work. Next slide, please. So before I go into the actual work, I wanted to ask some big questions. It wasn't obvious to me, at least when I got started, that OAuth was much more a framework rather than a standard. So the questions are, going forward, should we focus on standards more or frameworks, or are they both equally difficult to tackle from the perspective of doing human rights considerations? The second question was on the scope. The OAuth framework, it was difficult to decide where we should end the perimeter of analysis. And the third question is, from the perspective of human rights, is there any prioritization? Should we start with frameworks first or standards first? And then I wanted very specific suggestions on what we should do next. I will be joined in December by some of these people at the Bangalore office, where we could step up the work. And then finally, I think this another question that was difficult for us to grapple with, which is, when should the standard take the fall for a particular failing when it comes to a particular human rights consideration? Because of my math phobia and cryptophobia, I have tried to focus on standards that don't implicate both of this too much. Next slide, please.
Sunil, there is a question at the mic. Would you like to take that now or at the end?
I could take it now.
Leif Johansson, this is not so much a question, but I think maybe help. The term framework and standard here is just tomato, I think, in terms of when it comes to looking at something like OAuth. It has many names, right? The term standard has many names, and in this case, it's just an unusually complex set of specifications. I don't think there's a meaningful distinction to be made.
I mean, the way I was thinking of it was with a standard, then you would usually have a plurality of tools that are in compliance with the standard, and then that's a little more easier to understand. With the framework, the diversity as far as implementation goes is much more. So you may not get an off-the-shelf product which is in compliance with the framework, or it's harder to make this assessment. So maybe that's an oversimplified way of thinking through that question.
Yeah, I think it is. I think there are a lot of IETF specifications that have a range of complexity to them. And if you look at things like the SIP telephony specification set, it's about as complex as OAuth, or even more so perhaps. And do you call that a standard or a framework or neither? I actually don't think there is a meaningful distinction to be made.
Thank you. Next slide first. Then a few comments on the actual considerations, and perhaps this could go into the work that Niels just spoke about, which is the guidelines. So the security criterion was hard to deal with, primarily because the first question, I thought the answer would be common to all standards that we reviewed. For a non-expert, identification of new attacks is hard, especially when there is a lot of work done. And given the diversity in implementation, there are so many different actors that could be in charge of a particular entity in the flow. So for example, you could have national ID projects using OpenAuth. The next criterion that was tough for us to deal with was the outcome transparency criterion. So it isn't, as I've traditionally understood it from data protection law, the right to an explanation, but rather a mapping of the unintended effects of the standard protocol. So that was also difficult for a non-expert. And I think it is perhaps even creative work, and it's harder perhaps to take up in a kind of logical fashion. And the assumption that has to be made, and this goes back to what John Levine said, which is the person doing the human rights protocol consideration has to assume that the trade-off or the optimization between competing human rights imperatives has already been done by the working group. And I don't know whether it's the job of the protocols consideration to actually completely open out that debate, because protecting the right to property, for example, might need certain infringements on the right to privacy and so on. Next slide, please. So now I'm going into some of the criterion that is part of the assessment, and these are the first thoughts that we've had. This is starting with connectivity. So what it seems like is there is no application-specific functionality added to intermediary nodes. Second, that the framework cannot be developed in a stateless manner. That's what we thought was possible, was impossible. And we've heard some kind of anecdotal evidence that it is perhaps not optimized for low bandwidth countries, but we were not able to find any online reference to this or any academic literature on this point. Next slide.
Sorry. Is it okay if make a couple of more comments this later? Yes, on point 2 and 3. I'm not, it sort of depends on, it may be my understanding of how you use the term stateless, but I'm not actually sure that's correct. There are ways to use OAuth where you use asymmetric crypto, where you don't have to keep state in the nodes, but this may just be me misunderstanding how you use the term. And the third point, there is something called the ACE working group in the IETF, which sort of has profiled OAuth for the use in for IoT and low bandwidth situations. So that I'm not sure that's true either.
Thank you so much for that. Moving on privacy, again, very hard for me to think it through. So I thought about it a little bit from the perspective of a non-technical end user. So what seems to be the issue is the authentication period. And in some of our kind of telecom regulation, this was required that the data controller constantly check with the data subject whether they are authorized to continue to do or use their data for a particular purpose. And that kind of changed things quite dramatically. So, I mean, one way to deal with this to say that a question like this is completely out of the scope of the standard, and the standard should not be prescriptive about this particular question. But if you look at the usage of the standard very broadly, and if you look at some of the research that's out there, it seems that most users, end users, are unaware of these extended authorization periods. So that was a solution that we came up with. I, again, don't know whether this is appropriate at all, but that's on my slide. Next slide. In terms of content agnosticism, this we thought was an easy one. It seems as if the standard is completely content agnostic, at least as part of the initial process, and also the content that is delivered finally. Next slide. On security, this really took a lot of time, and we were still not able to read everything or even understand understand the implications fully for human rights. The working group has done a lot of work. There's already the security considerations in the standard itself, and there are two other documents that go into security threats and mitigation models. The community hasn't come to consensus. This is work that is still going on. But it was, as I said earlier, it became a bit unclear what we should do, what I should do as part of the human rights considerations. Look at the existing threats and mitigation models, the current best practices, and so on, and think through what some of the scenarios would be for human rights violations, or make it easier for somebody from the human rights world to understand the work that is already done. There's actually a separate conference where security of OAuth is discussed. So there's a lot of work, and it was very hard to stay on top of it, understand it all, or to even make any new contribution. Next slide, please.
Do you mind if I make one more comment?
If you don't mind, I'll.
You want to do it at the end?
Well, I would say I've looked at how many more slides we've got.
Okay.
And where we are on time, and I really appreciate the implementation of the considerations, but I think it almost deserves a session of its own to really discuss the relationship between OAuth and the model. So if I might suggest, because we're already 15 minutes over the end of our session, whether you have some thoughts, Sunil, that are a bit meta, like about the guidelines themselves, whether it was a useful exercise or not, and the way forward. And then we can come back to the actual example on the list, and also in relation with the OAuth folks, and continue on that, if you don't mind.
No, apart from the issues I've already raised, I think this is truly multidisciplinary work. It needs people with expertise in a very wide range of areas to tackle the work. And also, I'm assuming that for some standards and protocols, the work can be quite voluminous, the amount of data that has to be crunched in order to produce such an assessment. I'll stop here, Neil.
Thank you. I think this is, I mean, it's really quite a detailed and great analysis. I'm hoping that perhaps it's something that could be put in a draft that we could discuss further, because it being the first substantive use, or the second substantive use of it, it really would be worth spending some more time on it, perhaps putting it on the agenda at our next meeting. I'm wondering if you're willing to turn this into a draft that could then be further discussed, if that's okay, because it really is good content, and I'd hate to go through it quickly and lose what you've done.
So ideally, if I had managed to get a visa this time, I would have had at least some interviews in the corridors with members of the working group, and gotten the kind of feedback that the gentleman at the mic has been giving me, and avoided kind of obvious mistakes. So I'm absolutely working towards a draft. I will try and schedule some of these interviews remotely if the working group members have free time on their schedule.
And perhaps we can even talk about scheduling one of those interim meetings, conversations on this at some point in the new year before the new meeting, if that's something that would be valuable to you, and see if we can get anybody from, the working group that could give it more substance. So, perhaps we can talk some more about doing that. Thanks, Tess. And thank you. And sorry to sort of squeeze you on the time on it. Very much appreciate the work. And having done that to him, I'm basically going to take the next subject, which was moving on and how we move forward and how we continue the work that's being done, and take the draft and basically try to solidify the considerations, try and solidify the science between it. I'll take that discussion to the list and further to the next meeting. The last thing we had was another presentation that we had said only time permitting. I apologize, time doesn't permit, but definitely the presentation is there. It's something we can talk about on the list. And if it's of interest to the presenter to do it at our next meeting, we can sort of put it earlier in the session so that it doesn't get pushed off the end. I apologize for that, but I think we really had some good discussions and I didn't want to lose and cut those off. So I don't know if you'd like to add anything.
Maybe Brian wants to raise his hand. So if people have a really urgent interest in this highly important topic, they can connect to Brian or look at his talk, which is also on the internet. Maybe Brian can also share the link there so that there's the urgency, but also the warm-up for London. As you can see, beautiful slides. Beautiful. Really, they're huge.
Did anybody have anything to add at the mic? Did anybody have anything to add at the mic before I say thank you for your patience and for your contributions and discussion? No? You're walking to the mic. No, you're not. Okay, in which case, I thank you for the discussions, the meeting, the presentations. Thank you. And I guess that's it. Thanks.
For all the fish.
Anybody that didn't sign the blue sheets, they're on the desk at the front. Please get your signature on them.